we will take you through some of the key elements of the digital finance package and also highlight some of the implications that this package could have on the crypto world generally. So thanks again for attending this session. I appreciate you taking the time to join us. And again, I'd like to thank INATBA for providing us with the web facilities and logistics to make this webinar happen. So I'll start by giving a quick overview of XReg, who we are. So we are a specialist regulatory consultancy made up of former regulators and policymakers, all of which have practical experience in the development of regulatory compliance strategies relating to crypto assets specifically. We help governments make sound policy. We provide policy and strategic advice to regulators, other public bodies, and private firms worldwide. We help design, develop, and implement legal and regulatory regimes, offer training and education on virtual assets and DLT, helping teams upskill, as well as helping them build capacity to regulate and supervise this sector. And finally, we also help crypto asset businesses understand and meet the regulatory obligations and thrive as a crypto asset business. Your presenters for today, Siân Jones is a senior partner at XReg Consulting. As XReg strategy and public policy lead, she has extensive experience in policy formulation, regulatory framework development, and implementation that is leveraged by governments and public authorities to guide the development of policies within the jurisdictions. Siân is a member of the ISO Technical Committee on DLT and also sits on the Financial Markets Law Committee Scopum Forum and DLT Working Group. And until July 2019, she was a technical expert on virtual assets on the FATF's Policy Development Group. Siân gave evidence on virtual currencies on the European Parliament in 2015 and has participated in many discussions on crypto assets in Brussels since then. Before joining XReg, Siân worked at the Gibraltar Financial Services Commission as a senior advisor on DLT, previously having architected Gibraltar's DLT regulatory framework. Anna is our policy and international relations manager and one of our leads on this new EU digital finance package. Before joining XReg, Anna spent 4 years at the Gibraltar Financial Services Commission, where she was part of the authorizations team working primarily with banks and insurance companies, and later in the international affairs team, where among other things, she supported the GFSC's membership and participation in standard setting bodies. I am also a partner at XReg, having worked as a financial services lawyer for 9 years, before joining the Gibraltar Financial Services Commission, where I headed the policy team and led on a major reform of financial services legislation, which included the transposition of numerous EU directives and the implementation of EU regulations. I also worked on the policy and legislation for the DLT provider regime. So to introduce you to this webinar, I will provide you with a quick overview of the digital finance package. So this was adopted by the European Commission on the 24th of September 2020, and it consists of 2 pillars. The first one contains 2 strategies, one on digital finance and one on retail payments. The second pillar contains legislative proposals, 4 specifically, not all of which are crypto-specific proposals. And these are the following. So MiCA, which is a marketing crypto assets regulation, which we discussed during our last webinar. A proposal for a regulation on a pilot regime on DLT market infrastructures. The digital operational resilience regulation, otherwise referred to as DORA, and a consequential amendments directive, which aims to clarify or amend existing EU legislation. The digital finance package has 4 stated priorities. First one, to remove fragmentation in the single market, enabling an EU-wide interoperable use of digital identities. The second one, to adapt the current EU regulatory framework to facilitate innovation. Third one, to embrace and promote a data-driven finance. And finally, to safely address challenges and risks from digital transformation and enhance the operational resilience of the financial system. So I will now hand over to Siân, who will start with providing you with a recap of MiCA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ernest, and hello everyone. It's nice to have so many of you back on one of our webinars, and also to welcome those who are new to XReg's webinars on this series, or of this series. I'm picking here perhaps some of the few high-level points. Please bear in mind this is quite a lengthy piece of legislation, around 160 odd pages, and so we've tried to distill it into something that is meaningful and focused. Probably the paramount impact of MiCA is that it's going to regulate all crypto assets that aren't otherwise defined in EU legislation as financial instruments. So to be clear about that, financial instruments are have been defined for many years, typically in MiFID, and these will include a whole raft of both very narrowly defined and widely defined instruments. I guess you would say that everything that is simply not fitting the definition of a financial instrument, such as a security, falls within the definition of crypto asset, which I'll talk about briefly in a moment, is regulated by MiCA. MiCA sets rules for those who issue tokens, a range of rules of different levels of strictness, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. And it also defines the content of white papers. So white papers are mandatory or statutory, I suppose, under this sweeping piece of legislation, and they must contain certain prescribed information. It imposes rules on two classes of stable coins, which it defines as either being asset reference tokens or e-money tokens. And it establishes an EU-wide authorization and supervision regime for a new category of intermediary known as a crypto asset service provider. In many respects, quite simply put, but with huge impact across all those that are embraced within MiCA's scope, is that issuers and crypto asset service providers must be legal entities. And that will clearly have some consequences for those involved in crypto today who seek to continue operating in crypto once the new legislation comes into force. The three definitions out of an array of definitions which we need to focus on, because really the whole of MiCA revolves around them. One is the definition of crypto asset, which, and for these purposes, I've preceded some of the definitions to get the general context. But the very specific definition here of a crypto asset is something which is a digital representation of value or rights, which may be transferred and stored electronically using distributed ledger or similar technology. Personally, I have some issues about where they stuck the comma, but I won't bore you with the legal significance of that. The second definition is of a crypto asset service provider. And broadly speaking, this is anyone who provides a crypto asset service to third parties by way of business. And so we need then to understand what a crypto asset service is, and there are a list of such services, but they include the most obvious ones, such as custodians, exchanges, and that's not only fiat to crypto and vice versa exchanges, but also crypto to crypto exchanges, and also trading platform operators. Other classes include folks who give advice that is personalized and specific. So it seems that general advice such as, I think Bitcoin's going to go up tomorrow, is probably not captured. But hey, Ernest, I think sushi is going to go to the moon tomorrow, probably is, both directed and very specific customized advice to Ernest and may well be caught. And the third sort of key concept here is this, what I'm calling the rules stack. If we think of it as 3 layers, really starting at the bottom, which is subject to a base set of rules that are prescribed in MiCA. And essentially they apply to all crypto assets. So that's everything that was defined on this previous slide, everything that's a crypto asset. And that includes utility tokens, so they don't have to be crypto assets of a fundamentally financial or payments type nature. But all crypto assets, and more particularly the issuance of those crypto assets, are caught by this base set of rules. Above that, in the middle, we have what generally I think we all know of as stable coins, which have been categorized into 2. There are asset reference tokens and e-money tokens. E-money tokens are those that are referenced to a single fiat currency. So, for example, a token that say represents a euro or a dollar or a Swiss franc. The asset reference token category pretty much covers every other kind of stable coin. So something, a token that is referenced to, say, a basket of currencies, or to other cryptocurrencies, or to any other kind of asset, is considered to be an asset reference token. And although there are more strict rules for both classes of stablecoin, there are then differentiations between the 2 and very specific rules that apply to one or the other. And at the top of the stack, we have the most stringent rules reserved for significant stablecoins. You could probably imagine that a significant stablecoin might be something like Libra. And at this level, once deemed to be a significant token, there is not only a more stringent set of rules, but also more direct supervision at EU level. Now, when we gave our first webinar on MiCA, it was based on a copy of what appeared to be a pretty advanced draft that had been published in a Brussels media outlet on Politico. And this leaked version enabled us to have a pretty good idea of what MiCA was going to look like. And our previous analysis was carried out on that draft. The day after our webinar, the European Commission adopted the full suite of the digital finance package that included MiCA. And the particular version of MiCA itself was designated a provisional version. The Commission has since published a final version, a final proposal. And so our analysis today is based on that final proposal. I don't think anyone needs to worry too much about what has changed between the 2, or between the 3, in fact. Some headings have changed, but with no significant impact at all. Some wordings of definitions have changed, but they too don't really have any impact. One thing has been deleted. This was one of the defined crypto asset services that of providing payment transactions relating to asset reference tokens has simply vanished. It's been taken out. And actually it makes perfect sense because it was redundant by virtue of other things that were present in MiCA. Probably the most, I think probably the only impactful difference between the leaked and final version is that the start date for applicability for issuers of asset reference tokens has been brought forward. Now, in the timeline that we showed before, something I'll go over again in a moment briefly, asset reference tokens were to be caught with all the other types of tokens and the applicability to CASPs, crypto asset service providers, at the end of 18 months after the regulation came into force. But in the final version, this requirement was changed, and the date of applicability for e-money tokens and for asset reference tokens is now the date that the regulation comes into force. And clearly that's going to present a lot of challenges if it comes into force on one particular day, but there is no arrangements in place. There are no arrangements in place for example, a stablecoin white paper to be approved, which is one of the requirements, which will take time for competent authorities, for national regulators in member states to be able to set up the system to apply for that approval and to process the approval, and where appropriate to get to consult with the European regulators such as the European Banking Authority and the European Securities and Markets Authority. And so we see some very significant challenges coming around a date for stable coins to be subject to MiCA when that date is only the day that the law comes into force. We'll talk a little more about that later. Very briefly, looking at this timeline, MiCA has now been published. The package was adopted. There are now deliberations within the European Parliament and the Council. That is the representative body, if you like, of the member states, of the governments of the member states. Those deliberations will continue. The committee has just been formed in Parliament, for example, that will study the proposed MiCA and other legislative measures. And then eventually, both Parliament and Council will, if you like, have a position on that original draft. And then we get into the exciting behind closed doors phase, known as the trilogues, where the three institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council, try and work out a compromise, resulting eventually, a bit like smoke emerging from the Vatican when they appoint a new Pope. There will be a final approved text. That final text is then translated into all the official languages of the European Union. No mean feat, because each language version is authoritative, and then those versions are published in the official publication known as the Official Journal of the European Union. And 20 days after that, MiCA will come into force. As I mentioned a few moments ago, for asset reference and e-money tokens, it becomes applicable on that day. For everything else, there's an 18-month gap for competent authorities to get there to operationalize, if you like, their regulatory schemes, and for if you like, for it to apply to all those other areas that are defined in the regulation. Now, MiCA is just one of this package. As Ernest mentioned, there are a total of 4 legislative proposals. The other one that has very specific and direct relevance to crypto is the pilot regime for market infrastructures. And I'd like to hand over to Anna here, who will take us through the detail about this second piece of legislation.
Thank you, Siân, and hello, everyone. As we've mentioned already, MiCA was designed and proposed to deal with crypto assets that currently fall outside of the scope of legislation, whereas crypto assets that already fall under the scope of EU financial services legislation will be the subject of the pilot regime, although a very small subset of financial instruments that crypto assets that are deemed financial instruments. The reason the European Commission decided to propose launching this pilot regime was because, as it stands, financial services legislation in Europe does not cater for the use of DLT or on occasions limits it because of several requirements. Yes, thank you. Some requirements in, for example, or some specific rules are drafted which envisage both the trading and settlement activities to be carried out by separate market infrastructures, whereas when we introduce the distributed ledger technology, these activities could potentially be merged. This sandbox will be very different to the sandboxes that we have seen being established in different jurisdictions for testing in two main ways. The sandbox that, for example, the Financial Conduct Authority established in the UK permits newcomers to come into a safe environment to test the provision of innovative services or products, whereas this sandbox, this pilot regime, will only allow incumbents, essentially entities that are already authorized as financial institutions in Europe, to test the operations that they already conduct using this technology. And the other main difference is the length of time that the experimentation will be active for. So the other sandboxes that we've seen typically allow for testing between 6 months and a year, whereas this pilot regime is intended to initially last 6 years. In this time, market infrastructures will be able to test the use of DLT in their operations, and more importantly, it will allow national competent authorities and European supervisory authorities and the European Commission to really learn and understand the nuances of implementing this technology in different areas of the operations, and so inform the decision of what the future regime will look like. So in 6 years, the European Commission will decide whether to extend the pilot regime to test for a little bit longer, or whether it needs to amend existing legislation in order to allow for the use of DLT, or whether a new framework is necessary altogether, or whether they will have to revert to the way things are right now, where the use of DLT is limited. The way that some market infrastructures will be able to participate in this pilot is by applying for certain case-by-case exemptions, which we'll see in the next slide. At the moment, the organization and rules for market infrastructures in Europe are set out in European financial services legislation, which was updated after the 2008 financial crisis, most notably the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive and the Central Securities Depositories Regulation. A DLT market infrastructure will be either a DLT multilateral trading facility or a DLT security settlement system. So already authorized firms that will either investment firms, market operators, or central securities depositories are the only firms that will be able to apply for these exemptions in order to operate either a DLT multilateral trading platform or a DLT security settlement system. And the exemptions that they will be able to apply for, in the first case, are in effect in respect of the recording of DLT transferable securities on the distributed ledger that they're using. As it stands, investment firms authorized under the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive are required to record the transferable securities that they admit to trading to their platform with a central securities depository. But this requirement would, of course, result redundant if they're using their own distributed ledger, where they would be able to record these transferable securities. Whenever these entities apply for exemptions, they will have to propose compensatory, sorry, Siân, can we go back to the, yeah, thank you. They will have to propose compensatory measures to deal with the risks that will be left unprotected, let's say, by applying those exemptions. The other temporary exemption that DLT MTFs will be able to apply for is that of the obligation of intermediation. At the moment, multilateral trading facilities can only be accessed by intermediaries and not by retail investors directly. And by using the DLT, it is intended to allow investors to access the platforms directly, as long as these have the right safeguards to ensure investor protection and to mitigate any risks in relation to money laundering or terrorist financing. In the case of central securities depositories that want to apply to operate a DLT securities settlement system, all of these will be able to, these entities will be able to apply for several other exemptions. The first one is primarily in respect of book entry. Again, the recording of the transferable securities. They will be able to record these on the distributed ledger rather than in the traditional systems that they use. The second exemption they'll be able to apply for is in respect of outsourcing. At the moment, central securities depositories are only allowed to outsource one of their critical functions. And by using a distributed ledger, these entities may want to share the responsibility of operating the distributed ledger with their participants or members, and this exemption would allow them to do so. The exemption from the obligation of intermediation is very similar to the one we mentioned above, whereby retail investors will be able to access these security settlement system. The exemption from using cash settlement will allow CSDs to use, for example, e-money tokens or other types of tokens. And finally, they will be able to deny access to other market infrastructures onto their security settlement system, wherever they can evidence that it would be disproportionate to do so, given its size, or because it would be too complicated, given the legacy systems that other market infrastructures may be dealing with. As we mentioned, a very small subset of financial instruments will be able to form part of this test environment. These are one of the 11 financial instruments defined under the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive, which are transferable securities. These transferable securities will be deemed DLT transferable securities when they're issued, stored, and transferred in a distributed ledger. And for this test, they cannot be liquid transferable securities. And the value thresholds to determine whether they're liquid or not will be set out in this regulation, but at the moment they haven't yet been included. So investment firms, market operators, or central securities depositories will only be able to admit to trading or record DLT transferable securities on their distributed ledgers. And these transferable securities will be in the form of shares or bonds, notably not sovereign bonds. And the other bonds that may be part of this experiment are either covered bonds or corporate bonds or other public bonds. And there will be limits on the market capitalization of the issuer of the shares or the bonds. The maximum amounts are 200 million euros for issuers of shares and 500 million euros for issuers of bonds. There will be an additional limitation in the total market value of DLT transferable securities that central securities depositories can record on their distributed ledgers, and this is of 2.5 billion euros. DLT market infrastructures will be required to comply with additional requirements compared to those that traditional market infrastructures need to comply with. The first one is that when they're applying to their national regulators to make use of the exemptions that would allow them to operate either a DLT MTF or a DLT security settlement system, they will have to submit a clear business plan outlining how they are planning to make use of the DLT. And in cases where they're allowed to settle DLT transferable securities, they will also need to establish rules on the functioning of the proprietary DLT that they will be operating. Their IT and cyber arrangements will need to be fit for purpose with the introduction of the new technology. Very similar to traditional financial services requirements, they will have to have adequate arrangements to safeguard clients' assets. And importantly, they will have to have a credible exit strategy in place in case the pilot regime comes to an end or the permissions are withdrawn or certain exemptions are just discontinued because of the risks that they raise. And I'm going to stop here and hand back to Ernest, who will talk to you a little bit more about the other two legislative proposals that are part of the package.
Thank you, Anna. So I'm going to talk about the other two legislative proposals, which are less exciting and maybe less relevant to the crypto space. Although, as you will see, I'll talk about the Digital Operational Resilience Regulation, or DORA, does have an impact on crypto asset service providers and issuers of crypto assets. So this proposed regulation introduces new requirements, not only for CASPs and issuers of crypto assets, but for all existing financial services entities, so banks, investment firms, central securities depositories, etc., to have to comply with specific requirements in relation to primarily information and communication technology risks and cyber attacks. It will require, therefore, crypto asset service providers and issuers of crypto assets to comply with these additional requirements in addition to what's covered in MiCA, which we've already taken you through. So apart from the requirement to have an effective and prudent management of ICT risk and cyber attacks, firms will be required to develop a comprehensive and well-documented risk management framework in relation to ICT, which includes strategies, policies, procedures, protocols, and relevant tools. They will be required to implement measures for a sound management of ICT third-party risk, and they will also be required to report any major ICT-related incidents to the relevant competent authorities. Apart from those additional requirements, there will also be rules on cooperation among EU regulators. There will be supervisory obligations of regulators, and regulators will also have regulatory powers to take action against non-compliance of these new requirements. This regulation will also make some consequential amendments to a number of EU regulations, including the Central Securities Depositories Regulation, the European Markets Infrastructure Regulation, and the MiFIR, Markets in Financial Instruments Regulation, to make specific cross-references to DORA provisions. That will obviously make it, the idea is to provide some legal clarity as a result of these other measures that are being implemented. And the other legislative proposal, which is being introduced by the digital finance package, is a directive which makes consequential amendments and necessary amendments to other existing EU financial services directives, with the aim to complement and provide certainty and more clarity as a result of the other measures, DORA, MiCA, and the pilot regime regulation. So more specifically, it amends directives such as Solvency II, the Payment Services Directive II, the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive, to introduce specific cross-references to DORA. It also amends the Capital Requirements Directive to include specific ICT, business continuity and disaster recovery plans provisions, as well as also making some cross-references to DORA. And it amends MiFID II in a number of ways, to also add cross-references to DORA, to amend other provisions in relation to the performance of investment services and activities, to ensure continuity and regularity of those activities, to ensure resilience and that there is sufficient capacity of trading systems, there is effective business continuity and risk management, and a few other things. Importantly, it also aims to clarify the legal treatment of crypto assets that qualify as a financial instrument by amending the definition of financial instrument to make it absolutely clear that those instruments can be issued on DLT, and if they are issued on that technology, they are brought within scope of MiFID. So just to clarify, they do clarify that aspect of it, but they do not necessarily make it absolutely clear which crypto assets fall within the definition of financial instruments, and we expect there to be more guidance issued by the EU or by one of the European supervisory authorities to hopefully clarify that point a little bit more. One final thing that this directive does is complement the pilot regime regulation to enable the DLT market infrastructures that will be testing the regime under that sandbox, so that they can develop solutions for the trading and settlement of transactions of crypto assets that qualify as financial instruments. That's it for me. I'll hand over back to Siân, who will be talking a little bit about the different strategies being brought about by this package and the key impacts. Thank you.
So there you've had 4 legislative proposals, 3 regulations and 1 directive. And now we move on to the fuzzier strategies. So these have no direct legal consequences whatsoever, but they're, if you like, an agenda for the European Commission, which is the part of the European Union, the institution within the European Union that proposes legislation. And so it's an important indicator, really, of the direction of travel. And some of this, most of it is probably not that relevant to crypto, but some things may have, may set a backdrop for the direction of travel. So the first of them is the digital finance strategy, not to be confused with the whole package, similarly named, but the digital finance strategy is really a very high level document. It sets out really 4 main aims. 1, to remove fragmentation, in other words, differences that occur in similar operations but in different member states. It sets out to facilitate digital innovation. And I think this is an important one to look at. This is their word, facilitate, and it's not quite the same thing as to promote digital innovation. So if you think about MiCA and the way it's being applied to crypto assets and the way it makes crypto look very similar to all that already exists in the regulated financial services world in the EU. and you say, well, it recognizes crypto assets and DLT in these measures, and it tries to shoehorn them in. You could say, well, that's facilitating digital innovation. You would probably have a slightly different view if you were saying, well, does it in any way help promote these novel instruments and novel technologies, for example, in fields of financial inclusion? And you may well come up with different answers then. It also seeks to promote, by contrast to facilitate, but it seeks to promote data-driven finance. So it sees data and the data of individuals, of citizens, as being central to application of the digital single market as it pertains to finance. So if you think of this as being data-driven strategy, this would be very much in line, and that is an agenda that is being promoted, is being pushed. And the fourth and last focal area for the strategy is what it addresses as what it considers as addressing digital transformation, but basically to make stuff move smoother and faster in digitalization within finance within Europe. You may say that some of those objectives will have a directly competitive impact on crypto assets, a lot of which projects have been set up to try and meet exactly these aims, but in their own way. And so clearly the push here, I think, is to have the traditional world catch up with the crypto world in the impact that it might have. The second strategy is the retail payment strategy. So this is narrowly focused. It's been an area of attention for much of this decade, or this last decade, I should say. And it too has set a set of objectives over the next few years, which it's grouped together in 4 pillars. The first is to see an increasingly digital and instant payment environment in Europe. So this will include things like instant payments as the new normal, increasing trust in digital payments, and exploiting the potential of electronic identity. There's been a Europe-wide program, I think it's been running for 6 or maybe 7 years now, EIDAS. It's not really had the sort of impact that was hoped for, and clearly this is aimed at giving a shot in the arm to that. The second pillar is around innovative and competitive payments. So this is what it sees as really reinforcing PSD2 and a number of its, that's the Payment Services Directive number 2, that's already a few years old, but still in many respects, or certainly in some respects, still being implemented. There's a strand within it around security and a further strand around consumer protection. The third pillar is to produce a more efficient and interoperable retail payment system and retail payments infrastructure. And so there's a great deal of focus here around interoperability between payment systems and towards open and accessible systems. And the final part of that retail payment strategy is to make international payments more efficient. So a lot of emphasis there around making international payments, that's payments outside the borders of the EU, not within the borders of the EU, but cross-border payments from or to the EU, to or from elsewhere, that is, to be faster and more affordable across the piece. Something that has been to some measure achieved within the EU, but is still proving obstinately stubborn when it comes to payments beyond, which are considered still to be too expensive, too slow, and too inefficient. Now, for us, we've tried to analyze through these hundreds of pages of material really what the impact's going to be or likely to be for crypto. You know, a short amount of time means that we probably had to pick the top 5 or 6. I see there being some friction that is unresolved. One of the objectives for MiCA was to provide much needed legal clarity around crypto assets. It's certainly gone part way to doing that, but it's also left some things up in the air. There are different kinds of legislative measures in the EU. The one that most people are familiar with, the directives, are essentially EU-wide rules or laws that apply to countries, to the member states, that then have to implement those laws in their national legislation. And this always gives rise to some differences in terms of interpretation between one member state and another. The second category are regulations, and you note that all of the three main legislative measures affecting crypto that we're talking about today are all regulations. These are regulations that are directly applicable. In other words, when they're passed as law at EU level, they apply throughout the European Union without the need for any harmonization between the member states. So there's no further work that needs to be undertaken by member states in terms of their own legislation. There are obviously some legal and procedural things that have to be put in place. For example, with MiCA, a country will have to decide who is going to be the competent authority in that jurisdiction and make the provisions for that competent authority to have the necessary powers to implement the requirements of MiCA. But all these regulations apply equally across the European Union, and in fact, in the case of MiCA, and I think also the PRR, across the whole European Economic Area, which includes 3 extra countries. Financial instruments, you recall, are important in the definition of crypto assets. So MiCA applies to crypto assets that are not financial instruments, and financial instruments are very clearly set out and defined within the markets in financial instruments directive. So the directive is then harmonized into the member state legislation and are interpreted according to the individual laws of each of the countries. Now, this might not be a problem when you're looking at something like transferable securities, very easily definable, but it does start to get a bit fuzzy around some of the derivative products. And here you have interesting anomalies. For example, France has a particular interpretation in one of the conditions relating to a certain class of derivative that is influenced by other national law that has nothing to do with EU law, and means that it has to be interpreted in a particular way. Other EU member states do not interpret that particular provision in the same way. So here you've got a situation where if it's a financial instrument, then MiCA simply doesn't apply. If it's a financial instrument, it stays a financial instrument, it's regulated as a financial instrument. If it's a crypto asset that's not a financial instrument, but it might have some characteristics that are similar, of course, then MiCA applies. So MiCA applies everywhere across the European Union, but depending on which member state you're in, your instrument may or may not be a financial instrument, and therefore it may or may not be caught by MiCA. There are a number of these friction points at the intersection between most of the other financial regulation, which is in the form of directives, and these new regulations. These need to be clarified and sorted out. And arrangements for For example, ESMA, a Europe-wide regulator to issue guidance, may not solve all of those friction points. DeFi has effectively been prohibited. It's not formally proscribed, but the requirement for issuers to be legal entities has obvious implications for DeFi. And so the effective outcome is certainly DeFi as we know it today, as it's emerging today, and of course it's still very much in an early evolutionary stage, doesn't necessarily look completely possible within this new MiCA world. Similarly, privacy features that appear in certain coins, and indeed privacy coins, some privacy coins completely in their entirety, are again effectively prohibited. So crypto asset service providers will not be able to effectively work with coins that they, or tokens that they cannot identify their customer, or where they cannot ascertain the source of funds. And if you consider some of the privacy features which exist today, that again will be particularly challenging. And so it will effectively bar those privacy features from being used within the European Union. Now, there are no transitional arrangements for asset reference tokens, or indeed e-money tokens. So there are some very significant issues come the 20th day after publication in the official journal, as I highlighted earlier on, which will really be, I think, be highly unsatisfactory and disproportionate. And there need to be, we feel, some arrangements in place, transitional arrangements. Moving on to the last couple of points, raising capital will be harder for startups. One example of this is that in some circumstances, there are 8 times higher prospectus thresholds, 8 million euros available to securities in some member states under the securities under the MiFID directive, but that is hard and fast set at 1 million in the case of crypto assets. And finally, it's not really quite such a level playing field as was set out in the Commission's objectives. Banks, investment firms and payment institutions, for example, don't need authorization as CASPs. Only banks and e-money institutions can issue e-money tokens. And the pilot regime exemptions are clearly targeted at incumbents.
Yep, thank you, Siân. Before we go into the questions, I'd just like to thank you, Siân, and Anna for the presentation. Let me thank INATBA once again for providing the facilities and the logistics, and more importantly, thank you all for taking the time to attend this webinar, which I hope you found useful. As I said before, we'll be producing a detailed summary of the pilot regime regulation next week, and we'll send you all a copy of this document. Otherwise, you can subscribe on our website via the link that's now on the slide if you want to get advanced copy of any other publications or invites to future webinars. We've got one which I think was not answered from Wim Stallmans. He asked whether is DLT meant as a permission version of blockchain or also as a public permissionless version?
Well, I guess we can, it doesn't actually describe distributed ledger technology. It talks about distributed ledger or technology or similar technologies. And so if you look at how it's applied, for example, if I flip to this slide, I'm sorry, the one with the definition, then it's anything that falls within that definition. And clearly, you would have to take the widest interpretation of distributed ledger or similar technology. And so permissioned or permissionless really is no distinction.
Thank you, Siân. Martin Watkins asked if the intention of the pilot is to support investor protection under the Settlement Finality Directive. I'm happy to take this one. I think that the answer to that is yes. The idea is to ensure that the provisions of other relevant pieces of legislation are still adhered to. So investor protection is very much at the forefront of the pilot regime. I think there are some provisions that may conflict with the settlement finality provisions in that directive, but in that case there are some exemptions that may be applicable, but it doesn't mean that the DLT settlement security system cannot comply with the investor protection. They would need to probably find other ways of complying with those requirements. Martin is also asking if there is a facility in the pilot to commingle the ECB eligible securities with digital assets instruments. I think, if I understand this question correctly, I think what we just need to restate here is that the pilot regime will only apply in relation to existing so crypto assets that fall within the definition of financial instruments. So in that case, I'm not sure that there is an issue with commingling. In that the firm that is dealing with the different types of financial instruments would be able to deal with the crypto assets that fall within the definition of financial instrument in a similar way.
I'll just to add to that question, to that answer, Ernest, the only financial instrument that will be part of the pilot regime are transferable securities. So crypto assets that are deemed transferable securities. So as long as the ECB eligible securities are transferable securities, then I imagine there will not be any problem with commingling. Any other financial instrument, any other crypto asset that is deemed any other financial instrument is not foreseen to be part of the pilot regime at present.
We've got a couple of DeFi related questions. So Jordi Munoz is asking where DeFi projects stand on MiCA. No custody provider, no crypto fiat, and maybe I don't know if it's related, but how does the EU pretend to stop the possible tokenized financial instruments offered through decentralized dApps like Uniswap? Siân, do you want to take that one?
Well, and there are no specific bans on DeFi. There are certain specific things that you have to comply with if you're an issuer, and there are certain specific things that have to apply if you are a crypto asset service provider that might impact the ability of let's take issuing a token that is being offered to people in the European Union. To do that lawfully, you will have to be a legal entity. In other words, you've got a board and management and folks who can be held accountable. And if you don't, you're breaking the law. There's no specific targeted action to prevent it. It's the prevention measures are in the hands of national competent authorities, the regulators, in each member state, and if they seek to do so, they will seek to do so and look for someone they can hold accountable. And you know, if it was in the United States, they just keep on working down and down and down and down until they find someone they can offer to wear an orange jumpsuit. It's probably a little bit less aggressive within the EU, but clearly it is certainly most financial regulators have the powers to take action, and I anticipate that they will do so, albeit in slightly less aggressive fashion than in the US. Does that stop DeFi from functioning within the EU? Well, I think the answer has to be no, but it will become increasingly difficult to interact with DeFi services if they are effectively kept in the netherworld, and it becomes part of the dark world rather than the regulated world.
Thank you, Siân. And I think you've answered another question from Peter Davey, which he's asking whether DeFi is explicitly prohibited. I don't know if you want to add anything else to that, but I think...
Well, I hope I answered that before. There's no formal proscription it is in that sense, but you know, we're looking at high level at what is the impact of this of these legislative measures, and certainly in the case of DeFi, it puts a very significant ball and chain on some key elements of what makes DeFi, and essentially the outcome is to prohibit it from the regulated world, because you can't both be completely decentralized and be a legal entity. I can see lots of conflict. What I do see emerging, and it's probably worth just mentioning this, I think there will be new innovation, new hybrid models that will leverage some aspects of DeFi as it is today, with perhaps more formal structures, but only time will tell. As I said on another webinar a few weeks ago, some great minds solved problems in Bitcoin in the early days. Those of us who were around 10, 11 years ago and watched the first 3 or 4 years, 5 years of evolution of Bitcoin, there were all sorts of challenges, mainly technical challenges, and they were largely resolved. Great minds solved those problems, and I'm sure great minds will find solutions in regulation, or the regulation of crypto assets, really traversing the technical and the legislative or the legal aspects to come up with some new ideas, but time will tell.
Okay, thank you, Sean. We've got a question from Anthony Abel. He's asking, where would a property-based token, fractionalized title of property under government authority on a recognized authorized DLT platform, be viewed under MiCA?
If it meets the definition of a crypto asset, it's a crypto asset and it falls within MiCA. So if it's a digital representation of value that can be stored or traded using distributed ledger or similar technologies, then it's a crypto asset. There's really, I mean, there's been a lot of talk recently about, well, it's you know, the taxonomy is a challenge. You know, there isn't a lot of it isn't defined. Well, it is defined. It's just defined in very broad, all-encompassing terms, and if it meets the definition, it's included. So I would probably say, I mean, obviously the devil is always in the detail, but you know, in the generalized sense that the question's been asked, I think I'd have to say it is caught by MiCA.
Thank you.
Yeah, unless it's otherwise a financial instrument. If it's already a financial instrument, it's already dealt with, nothing changes. If it's not a financial instrument, but it's a crypto asset within that definition, it will be caught by MiCA. Okay.
We have a couple of questions in relation to the timeline, one from Aaron Shea and the other one from Joanna Mota. Aaron is asking, so from the timeline presented, realistically, it will only come into force on a national level in at least 3 years from now. And Joanna is asking, so estimated more than 2 years until this is in force.
Yes, I think that's realistic. I would be very surprised if we don't get to, well, there's certainly a mood within Parliament to not delay stuff in this space. And I don't sense a lot of objection to the broad thrust of what the Commission has proposed. There are some issues that I think will be taken up by parliamentarians. I think that they will get resolved in the trilogues, but realistically, between last month when it was published and when it comes into force, you know, a couple of years is highly likely. It could feasibly be less than 2 years before it comes into force. It could easily be 3 years before it comes into force. I remember when AMLD 5 came out, something that was theoretically a lot less contentious, certainly not as complex. It should have sailed through very quickly, and it in the end spent more than a year, I think, just in trilogues, whilst countries were hammering out and agreeing stuff between themselves. So realistically, it could go into 3 years. I don't think it will. And then once it comes into force, once it in effect is on the statute book, then you've got 18 months for most of the provisions to become applicable. The only ones that will be problematic will be around stable coins, which become applicable instantly it comes into force.
Great, thank you. And we've got we've got an extra question, I think, but another question from Aaron Shea. He's asking, as Gibraltar will be outside the EU by the time this becomes an EU regulation, do you think Gibraltar will change its own DLT regulations in line with the EU ones? I'm happy to take this one, and happy for anyone else to chip in, but I think Gibraltar will obviously be following this very closely to determine whether or not they need to they need to consider changing anything to align themselves with the EU. We'll need to wait and see what the future relationship between Gibraltar and the EU is. If there is some kind of cooperation between the EU and Gibraltar, there will obviously have to be something that Gibraltar will need to do to align themselves to this. But otherwise, this could also present other opportunities to Gibraltar to maybe distinguish itself slightly from the EU, where that is obviously possible or feasible in whatever circumstances we end up in post-Brexit.
Yeah, I think you managed to keep the Brexit word to the end there, Ernest, and I don't think we can escape the fact that although Brexit has happened at the end of January, so the United Kingdom and therefore Gibraltar are both now outside the European Union. We are still caught at the moment until the end of this year in a transitional phase where EU legislation still applies, as you correctly say, and when this is likely to come into force, of course, will be long after the last strands of the transitional arrangements will have disappeared. I think the key to this question, the key to the answer to the question, is really around the post-Brexit relationship between the United Kingdom and the EU. If you read the headlines over the last few days, then this doesn't look terribly comforting right now. But there's a lot of posturing going on, and it could all bring some minds together. My personal view is that we are going to see some sort of agreement. I don't think it will be hugely meaningful. I don't think it will be particularly meaningful around financial services generally, and as a consequence, the UK will have to determine really whether it wants to voluntarily align itself with the EU. Remember, the start point on financial services is that everything is already the same today, so it might make sense to keep in step, and hope then for equivalence regimes and so on to take over and allow the UK to participate. Now, if the UK participates in that way, then I'm sure that Gibraltar will do likewise. If, on the other hand, the UK goes off in an entirely different direction and decides that it's going to compete at every level with the EU and leverage every kind of opportunity that exists for something that's different, then that's going to make a very difficult set of decisions for Gibraltar. So Brexit, I think the outcome of the future relationship following Brexit will be a key. Personally, I think there are some huge opportunities for Gibraltar and other small jurisdictions, in fairness, peripheral jurisdictions, but Gibraltar in particular, because of its existing regime. I think whichever way it goes in the two scenarios that I painted a moment ago, I think that Gibraltar could benefit in both directions and benefit permanently.
Okay, thank you, Siân. I think we've got one more question on the chat. I think this follows on from maybe something you said, Siân. So Joanna Mota is asking, a European watchdog is predicted soon or in MiCA?
No. there's no Europe-wide regulator beyond the supervisors that are specifically referenced in MiCA. So most of what happens in MiCA, albeit that it is a piece of, it's a regulation that applies universally across the whole of the European Economic Area, the implementation is through the, if you like, the agency of national regulators. So, for example, the FCA in the UK, and as a consequence, really nothing much changes. However, for stable coins, and very much particularly in the case of significant stable coins, those are the asset reference tokens and the e-money tokens, you recall, then two European supervisors have a part to play. These are existing cross-European financial supervisors. One of them is the European Banking Authority, which has quite a lot of sway in terms of the significant e-money tokens, for example, and the European Securities and Markets Authority in relation to various other of the tokens. But day-to-day implementation, applying for authorizations, being supervised, these kind of activities, this will happen at a member state level. Because of that, this piece of legislation, MiCA, will be subject to the passporting regimes that already exist, which means that if you're authorized in one member state, you can avail yourself of the passporting facilities to offer those services. For example, if you're a crypto asset service provider, it's a good example, into other EU member states.
Great.
But no European, no separate EU watchdog for MiCA.
Okay, so that was all the questions that we had on the chat. If anyone has any other questions, we'll be happy for you to let us know by raising your hand, and you can take the floor and pose a question yourself. Anyone has any other questions?
No more bids, I think.
No more. Well, thank you. What next? Oh, we've just had a question from Bruno Schneider. Let's out. What next? What next, as in what next from the EU?
Bruno, I think you need to clarify whether you're saying what can we expect next from the European Union and its institutions, or what next after these legislative proposals, or indeed what next should issuers and CASP have in mind. I'll take the last one, and if you meant it to be other things, please do say so. Okay, so INATBA and other organizations, I think, are all working hard to formulate their positions now that MiCA and PRR and the other proposals have been published. And I know INATBA, for instance, has established two task forces, one particularly focused on its members to try and ascertain exactly their positions. And INATBA, I believe, is planning to publish a high-level document at the end of this week, sort of highlighting the key issues as members currently see them, and then to use that as the basis of dialogue with the Commission, with parliamentarians, and indeed with member states. And then there will be a much more detailed paper that will come out at the end of November that can then be used to substantiate and flesh out the points in the high-level document that's imminent. Other associations are also working hard in similar ways to assemble their views, and I think INATBA is particularly taking the lead in reaching out to other other associations to really drive home a concerted effort to achieve a good result for all their members and for the industry as a whole.
Thank you to everyone who has attended. As I said before, I hope you found this useful. Otherwise, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us via our website with any other questions you may have. Thank you.